On my wedding day, my mom grabbed my bouquet, ripped it apart, and screamed, "I should be the one walking down the aisle, not you." I was heartbroken until my dad's best friend stood up and said, "Actually, you're not even supposed to be here." What he revealed left the entire room in shock. I never thought my wedding day would turn into a full-blown disaster. I had dreams of a perfect ceremony, calm, elegant, and full of love. Instead, my mother made sure to turn it into a scene straight out of a soap opera. And the worst part? I never saw it coming. Let me start from the beginning. I never had a good relationship with my mom. She always made everything about herself. If I got an award in school, she'd somehow bring up how she could have been successful if she hadn't sacrificed everything for me. If I had a birthday party, she'd complain that no one was paying attention to her. When I got my first job, she said it wasn't impressive because she could have done better. So when I got engaged, I braced myself. I just knew she would try to make it about her. But I underestimated just how far she would go. At first, it was small things. She didn't like the venue. She hated my dress. She thought my fiancé's family was too cold. But then she escalated. She threw a fit because I wasn't letting her pick my dress. She cried when I told her my dad would be walking me down the aisle instead of her. She even suggested she should be the one to do the first dance with my fiancé since she knew him longer than I did. It was exhausting, but I held my ground. I was determined to have my wedding, not hers. The morning of the wedding, she was surprisingly quiet. Too quiet. I should have known something was coming. The ceremony started beautifully. I was walking down the aisle, holding my dad's arm, trying not to cry. My fiancé was waiting for me, smiling, and everything felt perfect. Then, just as I reached the altar, my mother lunged forward. She grabbed my bouquet right out of my hands and ripped it apart. Flowers scattered all over the floor. The guests gasped, my dad looked horrified, and I stood there, frozen. She screamed, "I should be the one walking down the aisle, not you." Silence. I felt my throat close up. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. Then, my dad's best friend, Mark, stood up from his seat. His voice was calm but firm as he said, "Actually, you're not even supposed to be here." The entire room went still. My mom whipped her head toward him, eyes wide. "What are you talking about?" she snapped. Mark walked forward and stood between us. Then, he looked at me. "Sweetheart, I wasn't going to say anything today, but you deserve to know the truth." I didn't move. I couldn't. He took a deep breath, turned to my mom, and said, "You were never supposed to be at this wedding. Because legally you don't exist." The guests started whispering, confused. My fiancé's parents looked at each other, unsure whether to step in. My dad? He looked down, almost ashamed. My mother scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous," she said. "I gave birth to her. She wouldn't be standing here without me." Mark shook his head. "Oh, you gave birth to her, all right. But that doesn't mean you should have raised her." I felt like the floor had been pulled out from under me. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark sighed and looked me in the eyes. "Your mother, no, this woman, wasn't supposed to have custody of you. She kidnapped you from your real home." The world tilted. I heard someone gasp. My fiancé reached for my hand, but I barely felt it. "That's a lie," my mother shrieked. "You can't prove anything." But Mark didn't back down. "Actually, we can." He turned to my dad. "You want to tell her, or should I?" My dad closed his eyes, rubbing his temples. When he looked at me, his expression was full of regret. "It's true," he admitted. "Your mother, she wasn't supposed to have you. She took you and ran." My breath caught. "Took me? From where?" Mark continued, "From your real father." Silence. I felt dizzy. "Real father." I repeated. "What do you mean?" "Dad is my real father." Mark hesitated, then looked at my dad. My dad swallowed hard. Then, with a heavy voice, he said, "I'm not your biological father." My head started spinning. I reached out, grabbing my fiancé's arm for support. "You were born in California," Mark continued. "Your biological father had full custody. But he pointed at my mother, took you and disappeared. She changed your last name, moved states, and convinced everyone, including you, that I was your father." My mother screamed. "That's not true. You're making this up." But my dad, the man I thought was my dad, shook his head. "I found out the truth years ago," he admitted. "I wanted to tell you. But she threatened me. Said she'd disappear again if I ever tried." Tears blurred my vision. My entire life, everything I thought I knew, was a lie. "You stole me," I whispered, my voice shaking. "You kidnapped me?" My mother opened her mouth, but for once in her life, she had nothing to say. And that was when Mark pulled something out of his pocket, a document. "Here's the proof," he said. "Your real father has been looking for you for years." At that moment, my mother lunged for him, trying to grab the papers. But my fiancé caught her and held her back. People were shouting. Guests were crying. My dad, not my dad, had his head in his hands. And I just stood there, my wedding completely forgotten as my world fell apart. The room was chaos. People were whispering, gasping, and staring at me like I was some kind of lost child just found in the middle of the street. My mother, or the woman I thought was my mother, was still struggling against my fiancé's grip, screaming at Mark, at my dad, at everyone. I raised her, she shrieked. I'm her mother. None of you can change that. But her voice sounded desperate now. Weak. Like even she knew the walls were closing in on her. I felt like I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, my hands shaking. My whole life, a lie? My real father out there somewhere, searching for me? I turned to my dad, not my biological dad, but the man who had raised me. The man I had always trusted. You knew. I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me, guilt written all over his face. I found out too late, he said. By the time I knew the truth, I had already fallen in love with you as my daughter. I didn't want to lose you. His voice cracked. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. I wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but my feet were glued to the ground. Then Mark dropped another bomb. Your biological father is still alive, he said. And he's been looking for you this entire time. My head snapped toward him. Still alive? I didn't even realize I had spoken out loud until Mark nodded. Yes, he said. And the moment he found out I was attending this wedding, he begged me to tell you. To tell you the truth. I couldn't process it. Where is he? I whispered. Mark hesitated. He's here. The room fell silent. My heartbeat was so loud it echoed in my ears. My mother froze. The rage on her face flickered into something else, panic. No, she said, her voice shaking. You wouldn't. Mark turned toward the entrance. And then the doors opened. A man stepped inside. Tall. Strong. His face lined with age, but his eyes looked just like mine. My breath caught. He stopped a few feet away from me, his hands trembling at his sides. My baby girl, he choked out. Oh my God. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. Tears welled up in his eyes as he took a step closer, then another. He looked like he wanted to run to me, to pull me into his arms, but he held himself back. Like he was afraid I would disappear. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Then, behind me, my mother screamed. No! She's mine. She belongs to me. She broke free from my fiancé's grip and lunged toward me. I didn't even have time to react. But before she could reach me, my real father stepped forward and caught her by the wrist. His whole body was shaking. But his voice, when he spoke, was like thunder. You stole my daughter, he growled. And you are never touching her again. My mother's face twisted into something ugly. She is mine, she spat. I'm the one who raised her. I'm the one who, you kidnapped me, I interrupted, my voice sharper than I had ever heard it. She stopped, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. I stepped back, looking at her like I was seeing her for the first time. You stole me. You lied to me my whole life. And now you think I'll just, what? Forget all of this? Pretend it never happened? Her eyes darted around, desperate, searching for someone, anyone, to back her up. But no one did. My dad, the man who raised me, looked away, shame burning in his expression. My fiancé had his arm around me now, standing firm at my side. Mark was watching with quiet satisfaction. And my real father? He was waiting for me to come to him. And for the first time in my life, my mother had no power. But then, as if her brain short-circuited, she let out a laugh. A cold, unhinged laugh. You think you've won? She hissed, her voice suddenly eerily calm. You think this changes anything? The room stiffened. My fiancé tensed beside me. What are you talking about? He asked. She turned to me with a slow, chilling smile. You have no idea what I've done for you, she whispered. The things I've done to protect you. You think I'm the villain. She laughed again. Sweetheart, you haven't even scratched the surface. Something about the way she said it sent a shiver down my spine. My real father clenched his fists. Whatever you've done, it's over now. You'll answer for it. She just shook her head, looking right at me. You're not ready for the truth, she said softly. Not all of it. I swallowed hard. What truth? I demanded. She smirked. And then, before anyone could stop her, she spun on her heel and ran. Out the door. Gone. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt my knees go weak. My fiancé caught me before I could collapse. My real father, my actual father, took a hesitant step forward, his hands shaking. I don't know what she meant, he said. But I promise you, whatever happens next, you won't face it alone. I looked up at him. At the man I was supposed to have known my whole life. And for the first time, I let myself believe it. But deep inside, I knew. This wasn't over. Not even close. I should have felt relief. My mother was gone, my real father was standing right in front of me, and the truth had finally come out. But instead of peace, there was a sinking feeling in my stomach, because her last words wouldn't leave my head. You haven't even scratched the surface. What the hell did that mean? My dad, the man who raised me, was sitting in one of the chairs now, his head in his hands. My real father hadn't moved, his eyes locked on me like he was afraid I'd disappear. My fiancé was rubbing small circles into my back, trying to keep me from completely breaking down. I swallowed hard and looked at Mark. She's not going to just disappear, I said. She's planning something. Mark nodded grimly. She always was the type to pull something when backed into a corner. That sent another wave of nausea through me. My mother, if that's even what I should call her anymore, had always been controlling, manipulative, and unpredictable. But knowing she had kidnapped me? That meant I had never actually known what she was capable of. What else had she done? What else had she lied about? And more importantly, what was she about to do next? Before I could say anything, my real father cleared his throat. His voice was soft but firm. I know this is overwhelming, he said, stepping forward. And I don't want to rush you. But I have something you need to see. I hesitated. See what? He pulled a small, battered envelope from the inside of his jacket. This is the letter your mother left behind when she took you. The air in the room dropped. I stared at the envelope like it was a bomb about to go off. She left a letter? He nodded. She wanted to justify what she did. To make me believe she had no choice. His jaw tightened. But I never believed a word of it. My hands trembled as I reached for the letter. The paper was yellowed with age, the edges torn. My name, my real name, was scrawled on the front in her handwriting. I took a shaky breath and opened it. My dearest girl, I never wanted to do this. I had to. They're coming for you. They always have been. I tried to fight them, but I'm just one person. I had to get you away before they could take you from me. One day, you'll understand. One day, you'll thank me. But if you ever find out the truth, if they ever convince you that I was wrong, just know this. I wasn't. I saved you. And if I have to, I'll do it again. And my head was spinning. They're coming for you. They always have been. Who was she talking about? I looked up, my voice shaking. What the hell does this mean? My real father's face was pale. I don't know, he admitted. That letter never made sense to me. There was no they. No one was after you. No one was trying to take you away from her. But I wasn't so sure. Because if that were true, if this was just her trying to manipulate things, why did I feel like there was something more? And then, as if the universe wanted to prove me right, my phone buzzed. A text message. From an unknown number. My blood ran cold. You need to run. She wasn't lying. My hands clenched around my phone. My breathing grew shallow. What is it? My fiancé asked, noticing my face. Wordlessly, I turned the screen toward them. Mark swore under his breath. My real father looked confused but alarmed. Then, another message popped up. They know who you are now. They've been watching. And they're coming. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I didn't know who sent the message. I didn't know if it was some sick joke or if there was actually someone out there who knew something about me that I didn't. But I did know one thing. This wasn't over. And whatever was happening, I was right in the middle of it. A heavy silence filled the room as I stared at my phone screen. You need to run. She wasn't lying. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded so hard it echoed in my ears. My hands were shaking, gripping my phone so tightly I thought the screen might crack. My fiancé leaned over my shoulder, reading the messages. What the hell does that mean? He asked, his voice tense. Mark snatched the phone from my hands and read the text aloud. The guests, still frozen from the earlier scene, began murmuring. My real father looked pale. I don't know, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. But someone does. Then, the doors burst open again. And my mother, disheveled, furious, wild-eyed, stormed back inside. You have to listen to me, she shrieked. A ripple of panic spread through the room. My fiancé moved to stand in front of me, but I stepped around him. Why? I snapped. Why the hell should I listen to anything you have to say? She looked desperate now. Frantic. Not angry, but terrified. Because they're coming for you, she cried. I tried to stop it, I tried to keep you safe, but you, she jabbed a shaking finger at me, had to dig too deep. You had to push me away. My real father stepped forward, his voice low and commanding. Who is coming? She turned to him with pure hatred in her eyes. You wouldn't understand, she spat. You never understood. I'd had enough. I stormed toward her, stopping just inches away. Tell me the truth, I demanded. All of it. Now. She hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the guests, then back at me. Then, she did something I never expected. She laughed. Not a normal laugh, a broken one. You really don't see it, do you? She said, shaking her head. You still think this is about me being controlling? About me being jealous of you? She took a deep, shuddering breath. I didn't take you to hurt him. She pointed at my real father. I took you to save you. My stomach twisted. From who? I whispered. She exhaled slowly. Then she turned to Mark. Tell her. Mark stiffened. His face, usually calm and unreadable, paled slightly. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. But his voice, his hesitation, told a different story. My mother's lips curled. You were his best friend, Mark. You knew. She took a step forward, her eyes locked on his. You knew what he was doing. The room fell dead silent. I turned to my real father, my pulse hammering. What is she talking about? He didn't answer. Instead, Mark did something that made my blood go cold. He looked away. The air rushed out of my lungs. No, this couldn't be. You were never supposed to find out, my mother whispered, her voice suddenly hoarse. I was trying to protect you. Everything in me screamed to deny it. But something about the way my father, my real father, wouldn't meet my eyes made me feel like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to fall. I forced myself to ask the question I didn't want the answer to. What did he do? Silence. Mark rubbed his face and let out a slow breath. Your mother isn't completely innocent, he admitted. She did steal you. She did lie. He hesitated. But she wasn't lying about why. I stared at my father. The man I had just started to trust. The man I had just let myself believe in. He was trembling now, his eyes wet, his hands clenched into fists. I made mistakes, he whispered. The words felt like a blade to my chest. I took a step back. No, I breathed. No, I never wanted to hurt you, he said quickly. I loved you. I love you. His voice cracked. But she ran because she thought she was saving you from me. She thought I was dangerous. I didn't realize I was crying until I felt the tears hit my collarbone. I turned to my mother, who was standing completely still now, watching me with an unreadable expression. And were you? I whispered. She didn't answer right away. She just looked tired. Then she said, I didn't take you because I wanted to be your mother. She swallowed hard. I took you because I thought if I left you with him, you'd end up like the others. A chill shot through my spine. Others? I turned to Mark. What is she talking about? He hesitated. Then, in a voice so quiet it barely reached my ears, he said, there were 3 before you. My legs nearly gave out. 3? 3 other children? I turned to my father, my biological father, and for the first time, I didn't see the warm, regretful man I had imagined him to be. I saw a stranger. A monster. No, I whispered, shaking my head. I never hurt anyone, he said quickly, stepping toward me. I swear to you, I never. Then where are they? I choked out. Silence. My mother wiped her face with shaking hands and took a breath that sounded like she was trying to hold back a sob. Gone, she whispered. They're all gone. My stomach twisted. I turned back to my father, searching for something, anything, in his face that would tell me this wasn't true. That he wasn't what she was making him out to be. But his silence was deafening. And in that moment, I knew. I knew she hadn't taken me out of selfishness. She had taken me because she had to. The weight of it all crashed down on me at once. My knees buckled. My fiancé caught me before I hit the ground, but I barely felt his hands. Everything I had wanted, everything I had hoped for was gone. My mother was a liar, but my father was a killer. The betrayal was unbearable. The pain unforgivable. I forced myself to stand, to breathe, to think. Then, without looking at either of them, I whispered the only words I could manage. I don't want to see either of you ever again. I turned and walked out. And I didn't look back. It's been a year. My mother was arrested 2 months after the wedding. Not for kidnapping me, the statute of limitations had run out, but for fraud and other charges that had piled up over the years. My biological father? He disappeared. No charges were ever officially filed, but Mark helped me dig into his past. And what we found, well, let's just say I stopped searching after that. I don't want to know. I married my fiancé in a small courthouse ceremony with just a few close friends. No big weddings, no grand speeches. Just love. Sometimes, I still hear my mother's voice in my head. You haven't even scratched the surface. And maybe she was right. But some things are better left buried. The end.